Welcome to Sigest, your fortnightly serving of digestible science from plant and food research.
Kia ora, ko Nicola Sullivan tēnei. Nau mai haere mai, and welcome to another Sigest episode. Scientists at Plant and Food Research are investigating our native wētā, which have been causing a few problems in the vineyards of Marlborough's Awatere area. This week we are joined by plant and food scientist Dr. Jessica Vereijessen. Jessica is the science team leader of the Insect Dynamics, Ecology and Sustainability team at Plant and Food Research. And today she's going to be talking to us about her team's work around the ground wētā and learning to live alongside this taonga species without it causing problems in our vineyards. Tēnā koe, Jessica.
Kia ora, Nicola. How are you?
I'm great, thanks. How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
Firstly, can you tell me about the wētā you're working with? And is this just one species of wētā? How many different species do we have in Aotearoa?
We have more than 100 species of wētā in New Zealand, and 16 of those are at risk of going extinct, so that's pretty sad. Out of those 100 species, there is different ones. So we have tusked wētās, we have cave wētās, we have giant wētās, we have tree wētās, and then we have ground wētās. There's about 14 described species of ground wētā, but there is many more that are still undescribed, basically. So this one that we're working with is in the Awatere area, is called Hemiandris bilobatus. Yeah.
Bit of a mouthful.
Yes, it is. Yeah, it doesn't really have a common name, so we just stick to the Latin name. But for this interview, we can just say ground wētā. Yeah.
Perfect. And what's special about this taonga species? What do we know about their diet and behaviour?
It's actually not a lot known about this taonga species, and that is probably why we're doing this research. So they're nocturnal insects, so they only come out at night, and during the day they're hiding in their burrows. So they are omnivorous insects, so they eat plant material as well as other insects. Yeah, and that's the plant material is where they become an issue early in the season in the vineyards.
Right. Do they eat any pest insects?
As far as we know, they do, but we have never really investigated when it's not budburst, because that's when they're a problem in the vineyards, but we've never really investigated what they eat when all the leaves are out, for example, so in January or February. So we are wondering whether they might be a pest during budburst on the eating the little buds, but maybe they also eat mealybugs, for example, or other pest insects, and they're actually doing a good job in the vineyards.
Interesting. So when did these wētā start appearing in vineyards? And is it only in the Awatere area that they're causing issues?
Good question. So this species, so Hemiandris bilobatus, is endemic to the lower tip of the North Island, so the Marlborough area, where there's a lot of vineyards as well. And it is known from the Marlborough area, but that Awatere area, basically. In the Marlborough area, they are not found in vineyards, but you can find them in the native bush that is, relatively close to the vineyards. In the Awatere Valley, we basically almost only know them from the vineyards. But for example, when you go to some of the more native areas and like a beach that's quite close to the Awatere, you can find them there as well, but not in the same numbers as we can find them in the vineyards.
Wow, interesting.
Yeah.
Do you think it has to do with not as much native forest around the Awatere compared to the Marlborough?
Yeah, of course, from historically, they, because they have been around for a long time, those wētās, there must have been quite a bit of bush around in the Awatere. Of course, there has been either burned or, it's been put into a productive landscape and everything. So the wētā have lost a lot of their habitat. What we think, because if you look at these ground wētā in their native habitat, at night when they come out, a lot of them go up into the shrubs or into trees even. So we call that perching. So they go up. So if you look at the Awatere at the moment, the only way up is vines or poles. And of course there are still native trees or some other shrubbery-like things around. But the vines, of course, are a great place to go up and start to see if there's any food for you up there. So we think that kind of behavior is kind of like an innate behavior that they still have from when they were still living in the forest. And of course, in the Awatere or the Blenheim area, in summer, the soil gets really dry because it's quite a dry area. But when you live in a vineyard, you have the drip irrigation, of course, and it keeps the soil really nice and soft. And that's where you see the burrows of the ground wētā as well. So they have, they for them, it's like a really great place to live. You have really nice soft soil to burrow in, and then you have either grass or lots of weeds, and you have those really nice fine buds that you can eat, just before budburst.
And so that's the challenge that the wētā present for winemakers, is it, that budburst?
Yes, it's only a pest for 2 weeks. So different varieties have different times of budburst. So it's basically like if you go from the early to the late varieties, maybe like a maximum of a month or so difference. And for a specific variety, it's only basically 2 weeks that the wētā is a problem.
Wow.
Yeah, and that's just when the buds are about to burst. And in that bud, you have some leaf material, of course, but you also have the little flowers that are coming up. So they really take a good chomp out of the buds. And if they take a good chomp, they kind of half eat the flowers as well. So,
and of course, those flowers then turn into the grapes, which is what they make the wine from.
I know. So what you see a little bit later in the season, when the leaves are out and you get the flower buds and then the flowers, there's empty spots on the vines.
Right.
And those are the buds that were eaten by the wētā. And sometimes you might have some leaves, but you don't have the fruit because they ate all the flower buds basically. So
interesting. And if you're walking down the rows in the vineyard, can you see the burrows quite easily?
It depends. In some vineyards, yeah, absolutely. But what the wētā does, and this really ingenious thing, so when they come out at night. When they go back, probably when it gets light again, they put a little ceiling at the top of their burrow, and then they go down. So from the top where we look from, you can't actually see the burrow. Then you have some burrows that may have been left, I don't know, maybe the wētā died or they decided to go somewhere else, so you see some open holes. So what we have to do to see if there's active wētā holes, that's what we call them, active wētā burrows, we take like a spade and we just scrape the top layer off the soil, and then all of a sudden it's like boom, 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 you see all those burrows, because that when we do that, we scrape off the little lid that they put on.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
So we've mentioned that wētā are a taonga species, which makes it a bit tricky. So how are the wine industry responding to that?
We interviewed quite a few of the growers or vineyard managers and owners, and they actually appreciate that the wētā was there first. And although they see it as a pest, the majority of them thought that we should not kill them and that we should learn to live together with them. But for their point of view, in a way that we lure the wētā away for 2 weeks a year or something from their vines, and make sure that they have a good yield, for example. And the wētā can do a lot of damage. So we took off some protective guards against the wētā, and like 2 weeks later, they just completely stripped those vines. So if they don't protect their vines, they will get a lot of damage.
Wow. So that's the tools that the winemakers are currently using, is it those guards around the
around the vine trunk. Yeah. So it's plastic, it's stapled together, and they have to replace it every 4 to 5 years maximum. What happens there is that they have quite a lot of strong winds. Of course, the staples in the wind, it starts like moving a little bit. Sometimes the sleeves are blown off, for example, or some sheep rip them off when they have sheep in the vineyards to keep the grass short. So the biggest problem from this solution is that it causes a lot of environmental damage, basically of pollution as well, with a lot of that plastic blowing around in the vineyards and into the Awatere River out to sea, for example. So although the growers really like the current management solution, they also see it as a big environmental problem as well. Yeah.
Right. So what would you say the aim of your current project is?
The aim of the project is to find solutions that make sure that the wine growers can keep growing, wine over there, and that the wētā can still be there as well. So we want to distract the wētā for 2 weeks a year, basically, that it eats something else, and then, they can come back again into the vines and maybe do their biological control, for example. Yeah. So that's the main aim. We have decided that, we don't want to go down the path of using anything like a pesticide, for example. So it's all about, how can we deter the wētā from either going up, so something similar to a wētā guard that they're currently using, or spray something onto the buds that just deters them from either going up or eating the buds.
And I know that you've recently been frolicking about in the Awatere Valley, according to your out-of-office email reply, which I loved. So when you're there in the field researching, how do you go about doing that research?
We went this time to set up trials to test some initial deterrents, and we don't really need the wētā to be there during the day, so we don't need them to be active. We know that they're down in their burrows. We may just scrape off the soil and see if the site has wētā, and if it has wētā, then we know we can set up a trial. So a lot of the work that we did last week was around putting those repellents on, and then some people had done some cultivation, and we just wanted to see whether that leads to less damage, for example, than when you don't have that cultivation. So we just set it up, and then we come back the next day. In the meantime, the wētā have been out of their burrows. They have maybe been up in the vines as well and have done the damage. And then so on the next day, we can actually see how much damage there was in each of the treatments. So yeah, that's what we did last week. And we also collected some wētā to understand their diet. So we do a gut content analysis and see what they eat. And especially when it comes to alternative intercropping in the interrow. And there's a lot of wheat species that people put in, or other things like oats and lupins and all kinds of different things, basically. And we want to know if we have these kind of crops growing in the interrow, whether the wētā would prefer to go there and go up as well, for example, and then eat flower buds instead of the buds on the vines. So kind of distract them at that time of the year. So yeah, we did some initial just looking at what vineyards had planted into row, so we can hopefully do some damage assessments as well. And then next year maybe we have a good view on what might be a good mix to sow into row for the growers, because it has to be quite high.
So that they'll walk up.
Early in the season. So say like mid-September or early September, you want something that is up there and has flower buds as well. So it's quite specific what you want.
Yeah, you have to overlap in those 2 weeks, don't you?
Yes. Yeah.
And so, as you've said, the wētā are nocturnal. Does that present challenges for doing the field work, or does it work all right just coming back the next day?
Yeah, it is okay because it's almost like working with the Northern Hemisphere, right? You go to bed and then they do the work and you come back the next day and, it just keeps going. So in a way that makes it quite easy. It's only that if we have to collect some wētā for gut content analysis, there's also a PhD student involved and she is looking at the gut content to make sure that we understand that diet. But she's also looking at the change in sex ratio, for example, between males and females. And then we have to go at night and we pick them up from the ground, basically. And during the day, if we really need them, if we don't have enough, we can dig out the burrows. But the burrows can be basically 30 centimeters deep.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So it's quite a bit of work to do that, yeah.
And so what does the gut content analysis involve?
The PhD student has done a visual one, so where you clean the gut basically, and then she has divided that up in plant material and in insect material basically, and trying to look at what species. Sometimes it's easier than other times, but apparently the vines have quite a specific leaf texture or something that you can quite easily identify under the microscope. And where we're going to now is that we want to do some sequencing on the gut content analysis as well. So we get probably some more answers, hopefully, from what kind of material they eat.
And how long will this research go for? How long do you get to frolic for?
Oh, frolic, yes. So this is the second year. We've just started the second year of this 3-year project. So yeah, there's only another year to go. So one more budburst after this one. And hopefully we'll have some clues of where the solution might be. Or maybe we have found something that works. Yeah.
And who are the collaborators that you're working with in this project?
So first of all, this project is funded by New Zealand Winegrowers through their New Zealand Wine Futures Fund, and it is project managed by the Bragato Research Institute. We're also working with 2 wētā experts from Massey University, and those are Professors Mary Morgan Richards and Steve Trawick. They have described a lot of wētā species and have worked on their ecology, so they're very used to working with the wētā. Mary and Steve are just a really great asset to the project. And they also have the PhD student, so she's working at Massey University as well. And then we have a whole PFR team. So we've got the researchers, we've got a Maori liaison person on the project. In the first year especially, we had a social scientist as well. And on the wider project team, we have representatives of wineries or vineyards, because the solution that we're coming up with needs to be practical and economically viable as well. So as a scientist, we're always really good at coming up with solutions, but they may not always be very practical for industry, or they can be very expensive. So these representatives are there to make sure it's a solution which they can work with. So it's quite a large team of people, but the owners or the managers of the vineyards have been so helpful and proactive so far. A lot of them are doing their own research as well and are happy to share that with us, or what they have observed in the vineyards in the current season. So they're not completely expecting the researchers to come up with the solution, and they're very happy to work with us.
Sounds like a great team for developing an outcome that works, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I really hope that we will get somewhere. But it's almost halfway in the project now.
Yeah.
No pressure.
Yeah. And being a taonga species, this project will have special significance to Māori. You mentioned a Māori liaison person. What engagement is happening there with mana whenua?
That's a good question, and because we are working with a taonga species, I thought Māori engagement would be top, and we could actually learn from them, right? From maybe veggie gardens that they used to have in that area back in the day. And did they see them? Or when they were hunting in the forest, for example, did they encounter wētā? What did it look like? All those kind of things. So once we started working in that area, it turns out that the Awatere was never had any settlements.
Oh, okay.
So it was more like a thoroughfare, like a pathway to other areas, but there were no settlements there, so no vegetable gardens that we could potentially learn from. So most of the engagement that we've done so far has been in the Rarangi area, so that's just northeast of Blenheim, and then in the Kekerengo area, that's just north of Kaikoura, I think, because those areas had settlements, but so far it hasn't really led anywhere. And one of the things that was written by our Māori liaison person was that he talked to quite a few people, of course, and that if Māori would have encountered wētā as a problem, they would very likely have eaten them.
Right.
Yeah, because they're just, they're probably quite rich in protein and everything. So, right. And they said that might have been, something that they might have done. Mm-hmm. But so far we haven't really had any links or so that Māori encountered the ground wētā. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, well, they're in the same insect order as crickets, aren't they? And,
yes.
And crickets are now eaten as a good source of protein.
Yep, absolutely, yeah. So interesting you say that, because the PhD student that we have in the project, she's originally from Zimbabwe, and she talked about eating crickets that were attacking the corn or the maize that they were growing. And she said, if this wētā would have been in Zimbabwe and would have been attacking the vines, we would have eaten it.
Right, interesting.
So it's interesting to see how, people who live in nature and collect from nature, how they view those things and go like, oh, well, it's a pest, but, it can be a very nutritious one as well.
Yeah, that's right. Well, that's great. I think we'd better wrap it up now, Jessica. So thanks so much for sharing the fascinating world of wētā with us and delving into an interesting problem of pest control without killing the pest. And to our listeners, thanks for listening to another SciGest podcast. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe and rate our podcast to let us know how we're doing. You can also email any questions or suggestions to scigest@plantandfood.co.nz. Until next time, thanks for listening. Mā te wā.